Welcome back to the Informing Choices mini-pod. Today, in collaboration with Working the Future's co-founder and director, Cathryn Barnard, we're unpacking a critical yet often overlooked issue that impacts all of us. Attention disruption, the Skim culture, and the battle for focus. In a world brimming with notifications, multitasking, and endless digital temptations, how is our ability to concentrate being challenged both now and into the future? In this episode, we'll explore the current state of our fragmented attention spans and consider how these challenges might evolve, what new distractions could emerge, and how will they continue to shape our workdays. We will then explore three major drivers behind this trend, then look forward into the future to consider both optimistic and pessimistic potential scenarios in 2030. Finally, we'll discuss actionable steps that organizations can take now that will inform the design of work environments and cultures to help employees maintain concentration and stay effective. Kat, it's great to see you again for another in our series exploring the trends identified in your Foresight Focus 2024 report.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be back.
So why don't we start with this then? How is our attention being disrupted now, and how will it be disrupted into the future, do you think?
Oh, big questions to start with, Steve. Thank you. I think that we are in the early stages of understanding how always on smart devices have the capacity to distract us and grab our attention and focus. I mean, I think we've seen some really interesting whistleblowing and former Silicon Valley executives coming forward in the last 4 or 5 years, warning really of the extent to which tech has been designed to steal our focus. One of the best books that I've read, which is a very short book by a former technologist from Silicon Valley, is a book called Stand Out of Our Light by James Williams. And he actually went on, I think he was studying a postgrad, maybe even a PhD at Oxford University, just about the extent to which social media platforms in particular have created mechanisms that keep us online. The underlying premise is, if you are not having to pay to use a platform, then the way in which you interact with that platform will be documented and tracked and sold to third-party advertisers. And so the business model of the Facebooks and the Twitters, and arguably LinkedIn to a degree, is to keep you online and engaged, because the longer that you spend online, the more can be discerned about your user patterns and the more data bullets that can be picked up about what are you clicking on. Is it clothes? Is it holidays? Is it cars? Is it animals? Is it whatever? All of those click insights build a profile that can be leveraged by organizations who want to sell their products and services to you. So what I'm really enthralled by and intrigued by is that, and it's a really recent thing, and I can't remember who it was that said it, but social media usage is almost another form of colonialism. It's another form of slavery. We are being enslaved. Our attention is being enslaved by malevolent third parties who are using you, the individual, for ulterior motives.
That's really interesting. I hadn't heard that that comparison either. So what about more focused in the workplace? How is attention being distracted there, and why do you think?
Well, again, workplace technology is not massively different to the technology that we're using in our personal lives. And in fact, I'd say that, the 2010s saw an infiltration into the workplace of the technologies that we were using in our personal lives. So I don't know whether we can probably both remember. Do you remember when executives had two phones, an Apple for personal use and a BlackBerry for business use, because Apples were deemed incompatible with workplace use? And then there emerged a trend for BYOD, bring your own device, which is ostensibly evolved into BYOA, bring your own anything or bring your own application, which is where users are bringing their own consumer choices into the workplace and saying, why can't I use Canva? Why can't I use TikTok? Why can't I use whatever? But so again, the ever expanding array of digital workplace tools creates an attention deficit. I think the pre-COVID meeting culture, the toxic meeting culture of back-to-back meetings, meant that focus time was under prioritized. And I don't see and hear enough evidence of organizations purposefully ring fencing focus time. There are anecdotal examples of it. I think, Basecamp is one software company that has documented its rituals and routines where they have days where nobody communicates with one another in order that the deep work can go on. But it's not commonplace, it's not mainstream, I don't think. And I think we have to just wise up to the reality that attention has become the new oil, and we are vulnerable to every flashing light, every beep, every ding. The human brain is hardwired for attention to be grabbed. Like, we're predisposed towards bright and shiny, and we're passively vigilant. So we're, any kind of small sign or signal that could be construed as a disruptor, we're there, aren't we, to make sure, almost genetically, just to make sure that we're not being threatened in any way. So we respond really easily. We are very distractible creatures, and unfortunately, the external environment that we now have to navigate for the future of humanity demands that we actually ring fence our time and put considerable deep thought into complex problem solving and overcoming some of the biggest challenges that face us.
What's fascinating to me about that is I've got this kind of continuum in mind now, so that even if I put my phone on silent and it vibrates slightly, and I put it on silent because I don't want to look at it, but I still kind of glance over because it's still distracting me. So from that degree, you have this disruption. From the other end of
I just want to, because you've just reminded me, sorry, there is some research that was done, and I couldn't tell you the detail, but researchers found that even the presence of mobile phones face down on tables in a group setting reduced the capacity of the individuals to focus on one another. So
wow.
even the presence, even when it was, phones on silent, the phone is a symbol, an artifact that equates now to disruption, whether we are consciously thinking about that or not.
I suppose, okay, so the other thought that just sprung into my mind then is how powerful the adoption of some technology can be into our basic human psyche, if you like,
Mm.
because there's no particular reason, I suppose, that I was going to call it an inanimate object, but it's kind of not, is it? But you know what I mean? Why should that be different to anything else? But the other end of this spectrum I was talking about was, I suppose, the combination of digital technology, culture of an organization, in part impacted by the pace and scale of change that we witness in the external world, is also collectively they're playing roles in causing this issue around attention disruption, aren't they? So, it's not just the technology, it's everything else that's happening around that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking we did some work a couple of years ago with a non-profit in the education sector, so a research organization. And the research and deep thinking was embedded in the psyche.
Mm.
So each and every person that worked for that organization conceived of themselves as a thoughtful person whose work involved deep focus and rigor. And if you compare that to many organizations that are technologically progressive, that stem from the technology sector or even the creative industry, there's a certain buzz and vibe, isn't there, in the creative sector about, being always available and always adaptive and always there and so on and so forth. But, I find myself contemplating, does a sort of noisy, vibrant work environment lend itself to Skim culture in a way that a more austere, serious, research-based environment lends itself to focus and, deep thought and so on? And it's quite interesting, isn't it, just to think about what the superficialities
Yeah.
create in the minds of the perceiver in terms of where you are more likely to get really good quality work undertaken.
Yeah, it's fascinating the more you think about this. So I think we've started to touch on these, but out of what we've been speaking about so far, which three key drivers would you draw out that underpin this particular meta trend?
So I think I have touched on them. I think the convergent forces of high speed, high availability broadband, increased computer processing power, increasingly sophisticated smart devices, and a colossal amount of ongoing investment by social media companies and their investment firms into the neuroscience of attention. We've had all of our psychological weaknesses exposed and manipulated. And the whistleblowers will attest to that. If you look at the work of Tristan Harris, who was former ethicist at Google, he has gone to great lengths to talk about the way in which the technology sector invests in ever more sophisticated tools and techniques to keep our attention hooked and online. And I've heard lots of people be vastly critical and disconcerting about Harris for being a poacher turned gamekeeper. But I take a more mild-mannered view, really. I just think, at least there's somebody alerting us to the reality. And whistleblowers never get a particularly good ride, do they? So
It's true.
I think, so those convergent forces, we're kind of fighting a losing battle to some degree or another. Those of us who are, educated and in, I guess, the top 10% of intelligence are already vulnerable. So, if you then cascade that back down through elsewhere in society where people aren't paying attention because they're struggling to have their basic needs met and so on. What chance is there? I think we have to get on board with, and I can't think where I heard it. I can think of the person that told me that attention is the new oil, but I think the sooner we get on board with that reality, the more awareness we can build around just how vulnerable we are to continuous disruption. So those would be, it's a modern phenomenon, isn't it? It's a very modern phenomenon that just wasn't in play for us as little as 40 years ago. But like we've talked about in other episodes, the kind of the gatekeeping ethical debate hasn't kept pace with the level of technological disruption. And you can only review, research, and evaluate after the fact what impact these technologies will have over the long term. So there's some brilliant research going on in the United States. For instance, at the moment, there's a fantastic social psychologist called Jonathan Haidt, who is looking into the long-term impact of social media and smart devices on young adults, like Gen Z, the first truly digital generation. Sherry Turkle over at MIT looks into the impact of digital technology on human collaboration, communication, and connection. And these are longitudinal pieces of research because the technology is so new. So we will not know the full extent of the risks that we've exposed ourselves to for years to come. But the work has started. And while the first findings are pretty dismal, nonetheless, the work has started, and that can only be a good thing.
Fascinating. I love that the idea that I don't the idea of smoking actually came into my head when you were talking about that, because there was a similar kind of evolution, really, wasn't there? There was this idea that lots of people indulged in. Then there was a period when actually we began to have concerns that perhaps this wasn't a safe thing to do. Then there was some idea about how that information was hidden by the producers, and then eventually we got to the point of view where we knew what was happening, why it was happening, and what we needed to do about it. And I guess the good thing about what you've just described is that the time period that it's taken us to decide that we need the research to make sure we understand what we should be doing with it is actually shorter than it was for tobacco.
Yes.
Perhaps that's a
Yeah.
positive.
Yeah. But that's a really good analogy. And I would mirror it with, what was known 50, 60, 70 years ago about the fossil fuel industry. But I think what we have to be live to is that in the case of tobacco, in the case of fossil fuels, in the case of sugar also, there is a huge amount of money that is poured into propaganda that would have you believe that these products are safe and without damage. And I think we have to then also, work on the basis that Silicon Valley and the social media platforms will deploy exactly the same tactics to try and underplay the social damage. I think, I'm going to call it, I think Mark Zuckerberg is a really interesting character, and every time he appears on camera, I find him, and Musk, I find them deeply worrying because they seem to not have the social capacity to care for what the long-term consequences are of the technology that they've created. The mindset is, can I make money out of it, and can it be done? And if it can be done, can I make money out of it? And that just to me seems really deeply flawed.
And I think that takes us nicely to the next area of conversation, which is about potential optimistic and pessimistic outcomes. for the the issue of attention disruption. And again, we've started to touch on both of these, and everyone likes a little bit of dystopia. So if this kind of attention disruption continues to be fueled by the kind of things you were just talking about, what are the implications of that in the future? And then secondly, what if it all becomes wonderful and our attention is managed to the best of our ability?
Yeah. Well, so thankfully for listeners, I am not a creative, and so I can't instantaneously conjure a film script for a dystopian futurescape where we're all wandering around like zombies because our attention has been so entirely captivated by malevolent forces. But I think we could riff off that and come up with something quite extreme. Without a huge amount of difficulty. Looking at the upside, however, I think there are signs and signals that the more can look out for and pay attention to. I think, we have to remember that the very first step in effective lasting behavior change is awareness, becoming aware of the problem that we face. And, knowledge is power and awareness is power. So if we know that it's not just us, it's not just my personal proclivity, my personal weakness for red pandas on Instagram, that I just can't seem to kick that habit. If we know that our environments are being designed to capture and hijack our attention, we can then take steps to introduce protective measures. I read a really interesting book last week called Dopamine Nation by an American psychiatrist called Anna Lemke, and she talks about just the way in which dopamine fires in the brain and how we are all kind of, coming to the end of a period of significant comfort and abundance and choice in the global north. So we have become habituated to expecting dopamine hits, but that's not the natural state of the human brain. The human brain is designed to balance out pleasure with pain, to get that equilibrium. And I think, the more conversations we can have about the topic, the more we can introduce appropriate practices into both our workplaces, but how we work as individuals when we're working in a distributed hybrid way. And I think, fortunately, we have got at our fingertips some amazing world-class researchers who are on this and pursuing this as fast as they can. So I think if you're a concerned citizen or a concerned parent or a concerned business owner, it's on, there is enough information out there to stay alert to the research as it's unfolding. And I think we absolutely do have it within our power to create and craft environmental conditions that help us eradicate the distractions so that we can focus on the activities that we absolutely need to create better futures for ourselves. So we absolutely need critical thinking. We absolutely need complex problem solvers. We absolutely need people who are curious. And I find myself wondering how curious you can possibly be when you're just being fed an algorithmic sludge of things that you've liked in the past. You might argue, well, I'm curious because I'm checking them out, but all you're getting fed is more of what has appealed to you in the past. There's no ability to expand your thinking. And we need our attention to be empathic towards our kindred humans.
The fascinating thing for me about that is, and I'm sure there'll be some research somewhere, it makes you wonder, the longer this situation goes on, what potential impact there is on the evolution of the human brain given that context. So the long-lasting impact could be quite significant, couldn't it, to humanity as a species, never mind the way we go about doing our work.
Yeah, massively. I mean, look at the neuroscience. Neuroscientists have shown through scanning that the brain is predisposed to synaptic pruning. So when you do not use synaptic pathways, they get pruned, they get cut. So a really interesting example, and I remember learning about this in my psychology studies, was in the early 2000s, if not 2000, some researchers at one of the London universities looked into the differences in brain size between London cabbies who had to learn the knowledge and regular drivers, and the learning of the knowledge, the requirement to know where each and every street and back street is in London led to enlarged area, the enlargement of the area of the brain that deals with spatial processing.
Wow.
So, and there was a marked difference between the London black cabbies who had to learn that to have their license and those drivers who didn't have to have that knowledge. And I'd argue that if that same brain scanning was done now, not for the cabbies, but if you took another similar set, I would argue that the part of the brain that is responsible for spatial navigation is probably largely diminished because we've lost our map reading skills because we just key in Google Maps and off we go. So to your exact point, use it or lose it, and it will reshape our brains if we do not create very deliberate tactics and strategies to protect our focus and our attention.
So what are, for example, the three things perhaps that an organization can do right now to achieve precisely that?
Do you know, if I was going to get started on this right now, I would convene and facilitate a conversation that just acknowledges how deeply problematic focus is for all of us. Because until you surface that conversation, most of us probably drift around our daily lives thinking, oh my God, this is terrible. It's just me. There's so much going on. I can't think straight. I need to be on top of all of these things. I can't focus. Normalizing the conversation around focus and attention disruption, I would wager, is one of the most powerful things you can do right now. And then from there, invite your colleagues to talk about rituals and routines that they have tried, played with. Experimentation, again, another thing. I know we talked about it in a previous episode. Experimenting with tactics to try and ring fence your focus, and we'll all have them, but I think, you know, social learning always happens fastest when people kind of borrow life hacks from one another. And then the final thing I would say, and I think this is just an invaluable practice to introduce into your organization for wider well-being as well, is to really encourage, if not aggressively promote, the practice of daily disconnection. So get out, go for a walk, don't have anything in your ears, you know, don't connect to a podcast or music or what have you. Just go and walk for 20 minutes, half an hour. If you can get out into a park, if you can get out into nature, you know, the health benefits of being able to do that are manifest anyway, but just allowing your brain to decompress and allowing the thoughts to come and go in a way that promotes mindfulness. You know, some of these ancient practices are absolutely what we need right now to reduce our stress and anxiety levels. And And we have to be real. There's an entire generation of people that don't know how to be bored, and they don't know how to sit with their own mind wanderings outside of artificial manipulation.
So it sounds to me like you were talking there about the benefits of both effectiveness and well-being, effectiveness at work and well-being across all of our lives.
Yeah, 100%. Digital hygiene is the one thing that is probably not thought about very much when it comes to workplace well-being, and it is an absolute integral factor that needs urgent attention.
Kat, thank you so much once again. That's been completely fascinating, as all of these conversations have been and continue to be on the podcast. So thanks very much indeed for your time.
You're welcome.
In the podcast description, you'll find a link to the Working the Future website and a note to how you can contact Kat to find out more about what Working the Future does. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And don't forget to let your friends and colleagues know all about the Informing Choices mini pod. We'll see you on another episode very soon.